"Step away, ma'am. You don't belong here." The words landed sharp and final, cutting through the hum of flashing lights and murmuring voices like a door slamming shut. Alicia Brooks froze mid-step, her sneakers scuffing lightly against the warm asphalt as red and blue reflections rippled across her navy scrubs. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and summer heat, thick and unmoving, pressing against her lungs. Around her, a small crowd had gathered in a loose circle, phones raised, whispers passing from one stranger to another, but no one stepping forward. In the center of it all, a man lay still beside a dented silver sedan, his chest rising just a little too unevenly to be ignored. Alicia's fingers twitched at her sides. Muscle memory from years in the are pulling tighter with every second she stood there doing nothing. Officer Daniel Hayes stood between her and the scene, one hand resting near his belt, the other held out just enough to keep her back, his posture firm, controlled, unquestionable. His eyes moved over her quickly, taking in the worn sneakers, the creased scrubs, the badge clipped slightly crooked at her collar. But whatever conclusion he reached, it didn't include trust. "I said step back," he repeated, calmer now but heavier, like a weight settling into place. Alicia swallowed, her throat dry, her heartbeat loud in her ears, but her gaze never left the man on the ground. Something about the way his hand rested, fingers curled too tightly, the shallow rhythm of his breathing, the faint sheen of sweat along his temple, it didn't sit right. She had seen enough late-night emergencies, enough quiet moments where everything could change in seconds, to recognize when something was off. "He's not okay," she said, her voice steady despite the tension coiling through her chest. It wasn't loud, but it carried just enough to make a few heads turn. Hayes exhaled through his nose, shifting slightly, his stance widening as if bracing against something he couldn't quite name. "We've got paramedics on the way," he replied, clipped, efficient. "You need to stay behind the line." Behind him, the faint wail of a distant siren threaded through the still air, growing. Slowly, but not fast enough. Not nearly fast enough. Alicia took a half-step forward before she could stop herself, drawn by instinct more than decision. The heat from the pavement radiated through the thin soles of her shoes, grounding her, but her mind was already somewhere else, back in a fluorescent-lit trauma room where seconds mattered and hesitation cost too much. "Please," she said, softer now, almost to herself, but the word lingered between them anyway. Hayes's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking briefly toward the man, then back to her, uncertainty passing through his expression for the briefest moment before discipline snapped it back into place. Around them, the world seemed to hold its breath, the crowd quieter now, the flashing lights painting everything in restless color. Alicia's hands curled into fists at her sides, her pulse steadying into something sharper, more focused. She didn't move back. She couldn't, because deep down, beneath the tension and the heat and the weight of being told to stay in her place, she already knew one thing with quiet, unshakable certainty. This wasn't just another accident. The siren grew louder now, weaving through traffic somewhere beyond the intersection, but it still felt too far away, like help was moving through water instead of air. Alicia drew a slow breath, steadying herself, the familiar rhythm of her training settling over her like a second skin. 12 hours earlier, she had been under bright hospital lights, moving between curtained bays, checking monitors, adjusting oxygen lines, listening not just with her ears, but with something deeper, something instinctive. She had learned to read the smallest shifts, the almost invisible signs that told a different story than what people saw on the surface. That was what pulled at her now. The man on the ground did not look like someone in immediate crisis to an untrained eye, but Alicia saw the details stacking quietly out of place, the slight stiffness in his posture, the uneven rise of his chest, the way his breathing seemed to hesitate between each inhale as if his body was unsure whether to continue. She shifted her weight, the gravel at the edge of the road, crunching softly beneath her shoe, grounding her in the moment. Around her, the crowd pressed a little closer, curiosity outweighing caution, a low murmur building as people speculated, guessed, filled the silence with half-formed conclusions. A phone screen glowed inches from her shoulder, someone recording, capturing everything except what mattered. Alicia's jaw tightened, not in anger but in focus. She had grown up learning how to stay invisible when needed, how to keep her head down and move through spaces where she was not expected to belong. It was a survival instinct, one taught quietly through years of experience. But tonight it clashed with something stronger, something that refused to let her step back. Officer Hayes shifted again, his attention flicking briefly toward the approaching sound of the ambulance before returning to Alicia, his expression controlled but no longer entirely certain. The authority in his stance remained, but there was a crack now, small and almost imperceptible, like a line forming in glass. Alicia noticed it, the way she noticed everything, but she did not push it. Instead, she spoke again, her voice calm, measured, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had stood in far more chaotic rooms than this. "I am a registered nurse," she said, each word clear, deliberate, not defensive, not pleading, just true. The statement hung in the air between them, simple but heavy with implication. Hayes's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disbelief but in recalculation, as if he were adjusting to new information he had not expected to receive. For a moment, neither of them moved. The flashing lights continued their steady pulse, washing over the scene in red and blue, over the faces in the crowd, over the still form on the pavement, over Alicia's steady posture as she stood her ground. The man's breathing hitched again, subtle but unmistakable, and Alicia felt it like a signal, like a clock ticking louder with every passing second. She lowered her gaze briefly, focusing on his chest, counting the rhythm without thinking, her mind already mapping possibilities, already narrowing down what could be wrong. The world around her blurred at the edges, the noise fading into the background, leaving only the essential details sharp and clear. When she looked back up, her eyes met Hayes's again, and this time there was no hesitation in them, only quiet certainty. She did not move forward, not yet, but she did not step back either. She simply waited, poised on the edge of action, ready to cross the line the moment it mattered most. Officer Hayes held her gaze a second longer than before, the moment stretching just enough to reveal the tension beneath his control. Then he glanced past her toward the man on the pavement again, as if seeing him differently now, not as part of a routine call, but as something uncertain, something that did not fit cleanly into procedure. The distant siren grew louder, cutting through the night with a sharper edge, yet still not close enough to take over, not close enough to relieve the weight settling over the scene. Hayes shifted his stance, one foot adjusting slightly on the asphalt, the movement small but deliberate, like someone recalibrating in real time. "You said you are a nurse," he repeated, slower this time, as if testing the words, measuring them against everything else he thought he knew. Alicia nodded once, her posture steady, her hands relaxed but ready, her attention never leaving the man on the ground. She could see it more clearly now, the pattern that had been forming beneath the surface, the pauses between breaths growing longer, the chest movement shallower, the subtle tension in the man's neck that suggested something deeper than shock or simple injury. It was not dramatic, not loud, but it was there, undeniable to anyone trained to look. Hayes exhaled, a quiet sound that seemed to carry more weight than it should, then glanced toward the perimeter where another officer was managing the crowd, the flashing lights reflecting off the cruiser's hood in restless waves. Everything about him still held authority, still held control, but there was a hesitation now, a thin space between command and doubt that had not been there before. Alicia recognized it, the same way she recognized the signs in patience, the moment when certainty gave way to something else, something human. The crowd had grown quieter, the earlier murmurs fading into a low, watchful silence, as if everyone could feel that something was shifting even if they could not name it. A child's voice somewhere in the distance asked a question that went unanswered, and the glow of phone screens dimmed slightly as people leaned in instead of holding back. Hayes looked back at Alicia, his eyes sharper now, not dismissive but searching, trying to place her in a framework that made sense. "If I let you through," he said carefully, each word chosen with precision, "you follow my instructions. You do not do anything outside of what I authorize." It was not permission yet, but it was no longer a refusal either. Alicia did not argue, did not rush to respond. She simply nodded again, once, calm and grounded, as if the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than this moment. Another breath from the man on the ground came uneven, catching slightly before releasing, and Alicia felt the urgency tighten again, sharper now, more insistent. The siren was close, closer than before, but still not here, still not enough. Hayes hesitated for one final fraction of a second, then stepped aside just enough to open a narrow path, not fully yielding, not completely stepping back, but no longer blocking her either. It was a small movement, almost invisible to anyone not watching closely, but it changed everything. Alicia moved forward without hesitation, her steps measured and sure, crossing the invisible line that had held her back, her focus narrowing instantly to the man in front of her as the world behind her fell away. The lights continued to flash, the night air remained heavy, the crowd held its breath. But for Alicia, there was only one thing left that mattered, and it was unfolding right in front of her. Alicia dropped to one knee beside the man, the rough warmth of the pavement pressing through the fabric of her scrubs as the world narrowed to the steady rhythm of assessment she knew by heart, her hands hovering for a fraction of a second before moving with quiet precision, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain. "Sir, can you hear me?" she said, her voice low and even, carrying calm instead of urgency, because panic never helped anyone breathe. The man did not respond, but his chest lifted again, shallow, uneven, a pattern that confirmed what she had already felt building inside her. She leaned closer, her eyes scanning, taking in the small details others missed, the slight discoloration along his lips, the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers curled inward as if his body was holding onto something it could not release. Behind her, she could feel Officer Hayes watching, his presence no longer a barrier but still a weight, still measuring, still learning. Alicia placed two fingers gently at the side of the man's neck, counting silently, her focus absolute, the noise of the crowd fading into nothing more than distant static. The pulse was there, but it was not right, not strong enough, not steady enough, each beat arriving like it was unsure of itself. She inhaled slowly, grounding herself, then shifted her attention back to his breathing, watching the rise and fall, mapping the rhythm against what it should have been. It did not match. It lagged, stuttered, paused just a fraction too long between cycles, like a system struggling to keep up. "He needs help now," she said, not louder, not sharper, just firmer, the kind of certainty that did not ask for permission. Hayes stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the pavement, his voice lower now, less command, more question. "What are you seeing?" The shift in his tone was subtle, but it mattered. Alicia did not look up, her attention anchored where it needed to be. "His breathing is irregular," she said, each word clear, deliberate. "It is not trauma alone. Something else is affecting him." She paused briefly, her eyes narrowing as she noticed another detail, something small but critical, something that confirmed the quiet alarm building inside her. The air around them felt heavier now, thicker, as if even the night itself was waiting. In the distance, the ambulance lights finally came into view, their white beams cutting through the dark, but still seconds away, still not here. Alicia adjusted her position slightly, her movements controlled, intentional, every action, guided by instinct sharpened through years of experience. She did not rush, because rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes here would cost more than time. The man's chest rose again, then faltered, the pause longer this time, just enough to make Alicia's focus sharpen further. She leaned in closer, her voice softer now, almost a whisper meant only for him. "Stay with me, okay? Just keep breathing." The words were simple, but they carried weight, a steady anchor in a moment where everything else felt uncertain. Around them, the crowd had gone completely silent, the earlier curiosity replaced by something heavier, something that felt like anticipation. Hayes remained just behind her, no longer blocking, no longer directing, but present, watching as the situation unfolded in a way he had not expected. Alicia lifted her gaze briefly, meeting his eyes for the first time since she had stepped forward, and in that look there was no doubt, no hesitation, only clarity. Then she returned her focus to the man, her hands steady, her breathing matched to his, ready for whatever came next as the sound of the approaching ambulance finally reached its peak. The ambulance rolled in with a sharp hiss of brakes, its white lights washing over the scene and cutting through the red and blue flashes already pulsing across the pavement. and for a brief second it felt like everything might finally fall into place, like the moment Alicia had been holding for was about to arrive. But as the back doors swung open and two paramedics stepped out with quick, practiced movements, the tension did not ease, it tightened, pulling the air thinner around them. Alicia did not look up right away, her focus still locked on the man's breathing, counting, measuring, feeling the rhythm slip further from where it needed to be, each pause stretching just a fraction longer than the last. "What do we have?" one of the paramedics asked as they approached, his voice controlled but urgent, eyes already scanning the situation, taking in Alicia's position, the officer standing close behind her, the gathered crowd, the stillness that did not belong in a scene like this. Alicia shifted slightly to give them access, but did not move away, her presence steady, grounded, as if stepping back completely would break something that had already become fragile. "Irregular breathing," she said, her voice clear and direct, not defensive, not seeking approval, just stating what mattered. "Pulse is weak and inconsistent. This is not just a vehicle incident." The paramedic nearest her glanced at her briefly, assessing, then nodded once, accepting her input without question, and dropped to the ground beside the man, his partner already preparing equipment with swift, efficient movements that spoke of repetition and urgency. Behind them, Officer Hayes remained still, his eyes fixed on the scene in front of him, the earlier certainty in his posture now replaced by something heavier, something closer to realization, though he did not speak, did not interrupt, as if he understood that the moment had moved beyond him. The first paramedic placed his hand near the man's shoulder, leaning in to assess, his expression tightening just slightly as he processed what he felt, what he saw, the same quiet warning Alicia had recognized earlier now registering in his trained mind. "He is not stabilizing," he said under his breath, more to his partner than anyone else. But the words carried enough weight to shift the atmosphere again, deeper this time, more serious. Alicia felt it settle, that invisible line between routine and something else, something unpredictable. The second paramedic glanced up briefly, his eyes meeting Alicia's for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, not of status or authority, but of shared understanding. The man's chest rose again, then faltered, the pause longer now, more pronounced, and Alicia felt the urgency spike, sharper than before, cutting through any remaining hesitation. She leaned in slightly, her voice calm but firm. "There is something else happening," she said, not louder, but clearer, her words carrying a weight that came from certainty rather than volume. The paramedic paused, just for a moment, his hand still as he reconsidered, recalculated, then nodded slowly, the shift subtle but undeniable. Around them, the crowd had gone. Completely still, the earlier curiosity replaced by silence that felt almost heavy, as if everyone could sense that the situation was no longer simple, no longer predictable. Officer Hayes took a step closer, his boots scraping lightly against the pavement, but he did not speak, his eyes fixed on Alicia now, not with doubt, not with authority, but with something closer to recognition, as if he were beginning to understand the weight of what had almost been missed. The lights continued to flash, the night air remained thick, and in the center of it all, Alicia stayed exactly where she was, steady, focused, holding on to the one thing that mattered as everything else shifted around her. For a moment, everything slowed, not because the situation had changed, but because the weight of it had finally settled into the space between every person standing there, pressing down in a quiet, undeniable way that made even the flashing lights feel softer, more distant. Alicia sat back slightly on her heel, not stepping away, just creating a breath of space as the paramedics worked beside her, their movements quick but no longer rushed, guided now by something more focused, more precise. The man's breathing hovered in that fragile place between steady and slipping, each inhale shallow, each pause stretching just long enough to make time feel uncertain. Alicia watched it closely, her own breathing unconsciously syncing with his, slower, controlled, as if by matching his rhythm, she could hold it together just a little longer. The air carried the faint scent of rubber and warm pavement, mixed with the distant hum of engines idling somewhere beyond the scene, but none of it broke the stillness that had taken over. Officer Hayes stood just behind her, no longer shifting, no longer adjusting, simply present, his earlier authority quieted into something else, something more reflective. His gaze moved between Alicia and the man on the ground, and there was a subtle change there, not dramatic, not spoken, but real, like a door opening just enough to let something new in. Alicia rested her hands lightly on her thighs, her fingers relaxed but ready, her posture steady, grounded in the kind of calm that only came from experience, from having stood in moments like this before and knowing that panic had no place here. She did not speak for a while, because there was nothing to say that would change what needed to happen next. Instead, she listened, not just with her ears, but with that quiet awareness that had guided her through countless nights in the emergency room. The ability to feel when something was about to shift, when a moment was about to turn. One of the paramedics glanced at her again, briefly, as if confirming what he had already begun to understand, and Alicia gave a small nod. Almost imperceptible, but enough. The connection did not need words. The man's chest rose again, then paused, and Alicia felt it like a ripple through still water, a signal that everything was balanced on something thin and delicate. She leaned forward just slightly, her voice soft, steady, meant for him alone even if he could not respond. "You are still here," she said quietly. "Stay with that." The words were simple, but they carried a warmth that cut through the sterile urgency of the scene, a reminder of something human beneath all the procedure. Around them, the crowd remained silent, no longer filming, no longer whispering, just watching, as if they too could feel that something important was happening, something beyond what they could explain. Hayes exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, and in that small movement there was a shift, a letting go of something he had been holding on to without realizing it. The lights continued to pulse. The night remained heavy, but the moment itself had changed, not louder, not more dramatic, just deeper, quieter, like the space right before a truth reveals itself. The paramedic's hand paused mid-motion, not because he was unsure, but because something had finally aligned, something Alicia had sensed long before anyone else had said it out loud. He leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man's condition again, this time not just seeing, but recognizing. "Wait," he said under his breath, the words soft but sharp enough to cut through the silence. His partner looked up immediately, reading the shift without needing explanation. Alicia felt it the same way, like a quiet confirmation of something she had already known deep down, something that had been building from the moment she first saw the man's uneven breathing. "This is not trauma," the paramedic continued, his voice more certain now, more grounded. "There is something systemic happening here." He reached for a small device from his kit, his movements precise, focused, as if the path forward had finally come into view. Alicia watched closely, her posture still, her attention locked in, not interfering, not stepping in, but present in a way that mattered. The man's chest rose again, shallow but consistent enough to hold on to, and Alicia let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding. The paramedic glanced at her briefly, this time with something different in his expression, not just acknowledgement, but respect. "You saw it before we did," he said quietly, not loud enough for the crowd, just enough for her. Alicia did not respond right away, her gaze still on the man, her focus unwavering, because this was not about being right, it was about what came next. Behind her, Officer Hayes stood completely still, his eyes fixed on the scene, but now they had changed in a way that could not be undone. The earlier distance, the quiet judgment, the assumption that had shaped his first words, it had all shifted into something heavier, something closer to realization. He took a slow step forward, not to take control, not to interrupt, but as if drawn closer by the truth unfolding in front of him. "What is it?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of authority, carrying something closer to genuine concern. The paramedic did not look up as he answered, his focus sharp. "It looks like a reaction, possibly something internal, not external impact," he said, choosing his words carefully but clearly. "If we had treated this like a standard incident, we would have missed it." The sentence hung in the air, quiet but powerful, settling over everyone within earshot. Hayes exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost beneath the hum of the ambulance engine, but Alicia heard it, felt it, the weight of it. For a moment, he did not speak, did not move, as if absorbing everything at once, replaying the earlier seconds in his mind, the moment he had told her to step back, the certainty he had carried, the line he had drawn. And then, almost imperceptibly, his posture shifted, not outwardly dramatic, but enough to reveal that something inside him had changed. Alicia finally looked up, meeting his eyes again, and this time there was no barrier between them, no assumption, no distance, just a shared understanding of what had nearly been overlooked. The paramedics continued their work, now moving with clarity, direction, purpose, and the man's breathing steadied just enough to signal that the path they had taken was the right one. Around them, the crowd remained silent, but the energy had changed, no longer tense with uncertainty, but filled with something quieter, something closer to realization. And in the center of it all, Alicia remained exactly where she was, calm, steady, her presence no longer questioned, but understood. The paramedics moved with renewed precision, their actions no longer exploratory but directed, each step guided by the understanding that had just settled into place. And the shift was subtle but unmistakable, like a room adjusting its balance after something unseen had finally been named. Alicia remained close, not interfering, but present in the space between decisions, her eyes tracking every movement, every adjustment, her awareness still anchored to the man's breathing, which now held a fragile consistency, not strong, but steadier than before, enough to build on. One of the paramedics nodded slightly as he worked, his earlier urgency replaced by focus, and for the first time since they arrived, there was a quiet confidence in his posture, the kind that only came when the right path had been found. Officer Hayes stood just behind Alicia, his presence no longer rigid, no longer defined by control, but by something quieter, something that carried weight in a different way. He watched as the scene unfolded, his eyes moving from the paramedics to Alicia and back again, and in that movement there was a realization that did not need to be spoken, a recognition of what had nearly been lost in the space between assumption and attention. He took another step forward, slow, deliberate, not to assert himself, but to close the distance that had once separated him from the truth standing right in front of him. "Ma'am," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the sharp edge it had carried before, and for a moment he paused, as if the next words required something more than habit, something more than routine. Alicia looked up at him, her expression calm, open, not defensive, not expectant, just present. The flashing lights reflected in his eyes, but beneath them was something steadier, something that had shifted in a way he could not ignore. "I should have listened," he said finally, the words quiet but clear, not for the crowd, not for anyone else, just for her. The admission hung between them, simple and unembellished, carrying more weight than anything louder ever could. Alicia held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, not as acceptance of an apology, but as acknowledgement of the moment itself, of what had changed and what mattered now. She did not say anything, because she did not need to. The paramedics continued their work, preparing to move the man carefully, their coordination smooth, their voices low and purposeful as they confirmed each step with one another. The man's breathing remained fragile but present, each inhale a quiet signal that the situation was holding, that the direction they had taken was the right one. Around them, the crowd remained silent, but the energy had softened, the earlier tension replaced by something closer to reflection, as if everyone there had witnessed more than just an emergency, something deeper, something that lingered beyond the flashing lights. Hayes exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering, the rigid line of authority easing into something more human, more grounded. He glanced once more at Alicia, not with doubt, not with assumption, but with respect that had not been there before, and then he stepped back slightly, not retreating, but giving space where it was due. Alicia turned her attention back to the man as the paramedics prepared to lift him, her focus steady, her presence unchanged, because for her, this had never been about recognition or acknowledgement. It had always been about this moment, about seeing what others missed and choosing not to step away. The lights continued to pulse against the night. The air remained thick with heat and quiet, but something had shifted in a way that would not fade, not for those who had seen it, and not for the man who now had a chance because someone refused to stay silent. The stretcher clicked into place with a soft metallic sound that felt louder than it should have, echoing briefly through the quiet as the paramedics secured the man with careful, practiced movements, their hands steady, their voices low and measured, confirming each step without urgency, but without delay. Alicia rose slowly from the pavement, the stiffness in her knees settling in as she stood, her eyes never leaving the man as he was lifted, his breathing still fragile but present, each inhale a quiet thread holding everything together. The ambulance lights washed over her face in alternating colors, red then blue then white, reflecting in her eyes as she watched them guide him toward the open doors. No one in the crowd spoke. The earlier noise, the speculation, the restless movement had all faded into something else, something quieter, more thoughtful, as if the scene had shifted from something to watch into something to remember. Officer Hayes stood a few feet behind her, his posture no longer rigid, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze fixed not on the crowd, not on the vehicles, but on Alicia. There was no rush in his movement when he stepped forward again, just a deliberate closing of distance, a decision made without words. He stopped beside her, not in front, not blocking, just beside, sharing the same line of sight as the ambulance doors began to close. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the engine filled the space, low and constant, and somewhere in the distance another car passed, its headlights sweeping briefly across the scene before disappearing into the night. Hayes drew in a slow breath, then let it out, the sound quiet but steady. "You saw what none of us did," he said finally, his voice even, not heavy with guilt, not searching for anything in return, just stating what had become clear. Alicia did not look at him right away. Her gaze followed the ambulance as it pulled away, the red lights fading gradually as it turned onto the main road, becoming smaller, then distant, then gone. Only then did she shift her eyes slightly, not fully turning, just enough to acknowledge him. "I just paid attention," she replied, her voice calm, simple, without pride, without weight, as if the answer had always been that straightforward. Hayes nodded once, absorbing that, the simplicity of it landing deeper than any explanation could have. Around them, the crowd began to disperse slowly, conversation starting again but softer now, more subdued, as people stepped away from the moment and back into their own lives, carrying something unseen with them. The flashing lights dimmed as one of the cruisers powered down, leaving only a faint glow against the dark street, and the air felt lighter, though the heat still lingered against the pavement. Alicia adjusted the sleeve of her scrubs absent-mindedly, the fabric still carrying the faint scent of antiseptic from her shift, grounding her back in who she was beyond this moment. She took a small step back, then another, creating distance not out of retreat, but out of completion, as if her role in the scene had naturally come to an end. Hayes watched her, his expression steady, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, just aware. He did not stop her as she turned slightly, preparing to leave, because there was nothing left to say that would add to what had already been understood. Alicia paused for just a second, her gaze drifting once more to the empty stretch of road where the ambulance had disappeared, and in that stillness there was a quiet acknowledgement of what had passed, of what had nearly been missed, and of what had been saved instead. Then she continued walking, her steps soft against the asphalt, her figure moving beyond the fading lights, leaving behind a space that felt different now, not because of noise or motion, but because of the silence that followed, the kind that carried the weight of something learned without needing to be spoken.